Hello, everyone. Welcome to video number 8 in our series on color Bible marking. The first 3 of those were introductory, talked a bit about what this is, gave you some practical things to try at home. Then we had 2 that pertained to lesson 1 in the booklet, 2 more that connected to lesson 2 in the booklet, and that brings us to today. We are starting lesson 3 in the color Bible marking booklet. That's page 19. Today we'll cover the exercises on the first half of the page. We'll come back next week. I'll take you into the classroom. We'll diagram some things on the whiteboard and we'll cover the bottom half. If you're interested in getting your hands on this material or the bookmarks, remember you can go to LyndaleChurchofChrist.com, click on the color Bible marking box. PDF files are there for all of this, as well as every video that we have posted so far. It is archived on that page. You can catch up or check them out again or whatever you need to do. For today, this is advisable, but here are a couple things that really will help you. One of them is to have a Bible with you in which you feel comfortable doing some marking. In fact, you can go ahead and have that open to John chapter 20. 2 of our exercises today will come from John's Gospel, John 20. Also, it's always a good idea to keep all 6 of your colored pencils around in your bookmark, but here's what you really need for today: a mechanical pencil. Last week, we used this pencil to box in all names. We always wanted to know who was in the room, who was a part of the story. Today, we continue using the mechanical pencil, except we are circling locations. I don't just want to know who it was, I also want to know where they were. And if they change and go somewhere else, another town or another place, I want to make sure that I circle that. We'll also be using the red map pencil to squiggle in time phrases. If it says early in the morning, we want to know that. If it's the next day or a year and a half, anytime they change location or time, we want to make notation. So think about how that all comes together, lessons 2 and 3. If you do this through especially the 4 Gospels, the journey of Jesus, and certainly the book of Acts and the progress of Peter and Paul, then you will always know who's involved, where they are, and when it took place. And that comes together to create a fuller picture of the events. Later, when you're looking back on these stories, you can instantly pick up where you left off and know what's going on. And I hope you find that advantageous. That's what we'll be doing for the next few minutes. So, those are the things you need. I also very, very highly advise, though it's not required, that you have a fresh cup of coffee in a George W. coffee mug. George W., if you have it. Okay, let's jump right in. You're in John 20. I want to look at a couple of the exercises here. They're in the booklet beginning on page 20, but you have your Bibles open to John chapter 20, which we know to be the events of Jesus' resurrection and the interaction with the disciples beginning on the first day of the week. So if you're looking at that and you go through and do last week's exercise, you box in all the names. You've got Mary Magdalene there in verse 1 and Simon Peter in verse 2 and the 2 angels in verse 12. So you know everybody that's involved. But now we're going to layer in more information. So look at verse 1, John 20, verse 1. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb. 19, we have a big change in the event. It says, so when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week. Take your red pencil and squiggle right through that. I know it's still Sunday, but a handful of hours have passed, which is very useful when you're harmonizing the other gospels. And I also circled when the doors were shut where the disciples were. So it's a different time of day and it's a different location. Then you have Jesus interacting with the disciples there. Thomas wasn't there, but the other 10 of them were. And you get down to verse 26. After 8 days, his disciples were again inside. Change of time, change presumably of location. And this is where he interacts with who we call doubting Thomas. Just remember, Thomas had waited 8 days. They'd been telling him about Jesus and he hadn't seen him. He needed to have more faith, but he'd certainly been waiting a while. So look in John 21. What you would circle in John 21, verse 1, is the Sea of Tiberias. We don't know how many days have passed, but we know he's in a totally different location. We box in the names of the people who were there. We get to verse 4. When the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach. So now we know when and where, and the chapter unfolds. Verse 14, finally, John 21:14. Now, this is now the third time that Jesus was manifested. Now, if somebody looked at that and said, third time, what were the first two times? It would take you about 5 seconds to turn back and say, well, the first time was evening on the first day of the week in a room. The second time was 8 days later in a room. Thomas was there. And the third time is now some days later at a beach by the sea, and you can easily track all of that. So imagine being able to do that through his entire ministry. I know where he is and how long he was there, and I can visualize the scene changes. Imagine doing that with Paul's journeys. I know when he's in Corinth and that he's there for a year and a half. I know when he's in Ephesus, I have that circled. He's there for 2 years. It would be really cool if you could go to Acts 13 and 14 right now. Take your finger and track Paul's entire first missionary journey just by the circles. He started here, and he met that guy, and then here, and like that. That helps you tremendously later when you're studying the epistles. Before you read the book of Ephesians, you're going to want to go find out when Paul was in Ephesus and the events that took place there, and you'll find yourself referencing back often. Also, a really valuable exercise when looking at the history books in the Old Testament, the kings and prophets, and where they were and when they were there. All right, let me give you another exercise. You're in John's gospel. Remember, we talked a lot about John 13 through 17. John 13 through 17, Jesus is with the apostles. We boxed in the names of all the different apostles. We saw that Matthew, Mark, and Luke told us he was there with the 12 apostles. But if you'll go back to John chapter 13, verse 1, you can also take your pencil and say, before the feast of the Passover. It's the feast of the Passover and the events that precede it. In John 13, verse 2, during supper. During supper. I know where he is. He's at supper with the apostles. And I know that the events of chapter 13 take place during supper. The events of chapter 14 take place during supper. There are no circles, no changes. At the end of chapter 14 in verse 31, let us go from there. So it looks like they get up. Judas is gone, of course, but the rest of them get up and follow Jesus out of that room. They probably pass some vines because he tells them about the vines and the branches. But he travels with them through chapter 15. He's with them in chapter 16 and 17. There's really not a change of scene until chapter 18, verse 1, when they go over, you notice verse 1, the ravine of the Kidron, and they come to the garden. So I can see that he's with the apostles for all 5 chapters, and that it really doesn't move to the next phase until the next event that's circled in chapter 18. That's just an example of how that would work. So I'm encouraging you to do that in Jesus' journeys and do it in Paul's journeys. And I think you'll find all of that completes the picture for you and helps you understand what's going on. Let me give you one more thing to think about. This actually came up just the other day, and I want to make sure I get the verse references right. But someone was asking about an event that took place in Jesus' life. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus heals the centurion's servant. Do you remember that? We talked about authority. And we learn in Matthew 8 and verse 5 that Jesus entered into Capernaum and he healed the centurion's servant in Capernaum. Now, if you go over to Luke 7, it looks like it's the same story. In Luke 7, there's a centurion, there's a servant, they're in Capernaum, and Jesus heals him. But the question is, what about John 4? In John 4, it looks like the same event, except it's not the centurion, it's the royal official. And it's not his servant, it's his son. And they're in Capernaum, and Jesus heals them. So people have asked, is this the same event or is it a different event? And if it's the same, why are the wording different? And maybe it's even a contradiction. Some people are always looking for those. But you'll note in John 4:46 that while the boy was in Capernaum, guess where Jesus was? He was in Cana of Galilee. Got it circled right there in verse 46. So I know instantly that they're different stories because Jesus is in a different place when those stories happen. That's the Bible nerd in me. I like making connections like that and seeing those things. I hope you're enjoying it as well. We'll have more to come next week. We'll dig in a little bit and diagram some passing of time. I hope you find these exercises helpful. Remember to like the Color Bible Marking Facebook page. Share this video if you think it will help someone else. And Lord willing, next week, more to come.